An economy winding down, a workforce fearful about making ends meet. 4 days into the coronavirus lockdown, and tradespeople, hairdressers, painters and decorators were waiting to hear if the government would rally to their side. A helping hand had been offered to salaried employees, and today the budget-a-week Chancellor finally acted for the self-employed.
To you, I say this: you have not been forgotten. We will not let you behind. We all stand together.
The £9 billion scheme is designed to cover 3.8 million people, 95% of those who receive a majority of their income from self-employed work. They will be able to claim 80% of their average monthly trading profit over the last 3 years, with a cap of £2,500 a month. That places them on a par with salaried employees. And the scheme will last for 3 months, but may be extended. Some strings will be attached. Anyone whose trading profit is above £50,000 will be ineligible, and money will not be provided until June, potentially forcing some self-employed people onto welfare.
These last 10 days have shaken our country and economy as never before. In the last 2 weeks, we have put aside ideology and orthodoxy to mobilise the full power and resources of the British state. We have done so in the pursuit of a single goal: to protect people's health and economic security, by supporting public services like the NHS, backing businesses, and protecting people's jobs and incomes. What we have done will, I believe, stand as one of the most significant economic interventions at any point in the history of the British state and by any government anywhere in the world.
But a hairdresser who will still struggle is not impressed.
Yes, that's nice to say that, oh, we've got a package going, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. However, what about now? What about now? I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's fair. I do appreciate, totally, I'm talking on circumstances here, because there are a lot of people out there that think, brilliant, great, thanks for that, that's amazing. I've got enough in the bank there to, just roll through. And if I know I'm 100% getting that, my salary's been pretty steady. But as I say, for me, on a personal level, that's not the case.
Rishi Sunak knows that his scheme cannot satisfy everybody, but he does believe that this is one of his most significant interventions of this crisis, though it does come with a sting in the tail for the self-employed. The Chancellor has served notice on them that when this is all over, they can expect to pay the same level of tax as everyone else. One economist believes the Chancellor has taken a big step.
We are definitely seeing the British state doing far more than we've seen it do in previous crises. We are socialising, sharing the pain of the economic hit from this crisis out across all of us through the state. That means higher taxes to pay back that borrowing in future. But that's the right thing to do, because we're asking people to put their livelihoods on the line so that we can save lives. And if we're going to ask them to do that, then we have to protect their livelihoods too.
A country in lockdown, pondering the shape of our society and economy once the virus has inflicted its pain.
Nick joins me now. Nick, you've got an update on other figures, don't you?
That's right, Emma. Once again, it is the sad daily task of looking at the human toll of coronavirus. So if we look at this graph here, we'll say that the latest figures show that as of 5 p.m. yesterday, 578 people who've tested positive for coronavirus have died. Now, that is an increase of 115 on the previous figure, and that is noticeably higher than the increase the previous day before that, which was 43. Now, as I was saying last night, we shouldn't read too much into that, because what the government and the NHS are trying to do is align the timings for these deaths across the 4 nations of the UK. And the government is pretty confident that the pattern is going up in a steady way. And the reason for the difference is that the lower toll that was released yesterday, that covered 8 hours of figures, whereas the higher toll released today, that covered 24 hours.
Talk to us about the government's preparations for pandemics before. What have you found out about that?
Well, our BBC colleague Roger Harrison tweeted this afternoon that the government's former chief scientific advisor, Professor Sir David King, had said that a report in 2016, a government report, had showed that the UK was not ready for a pandemic. Now, I spoke to somebody who was involved in that week-long exercise in 2016 where they basically acted out the state's response. Now, crucially, it covered a flu pandemic, which could therefore be treated with antivirals. Coronavirus is, of course, a virus. Therefore, at the moment, there is no vaccination. The way that it was put to me was it wasn't so much that the government was failing. It was more stress testing. It was more lessons learned. But there were some big weaknesses that were highlighted. The first one was the danger, the very real danger of NHS workers becoming ill. The way that it was put to me was the attrition amongst NHS staff. The other thing it highlighted was the hugely difficult moral dilemma. What this exercise showed was that intensive care beds in the early stage of the pandemic would be taken up by elderly people, many of whom would have little or no chance of recovery. In the later stages, younger people would need the intensive care beds, but they couldn't get into them. Big dilemma. What do you do there? Another area that it highlighted where there was a problem was how you manage and deal with crematoria and mortuaries. Interestingly, I would be pretty sure that the Treasury would be very heavily involved in that exercise, but my person who was involved didn't mention anything about economic preparation, which may give you some indication of why it took Rishi Sunak so long to make this announcement on the self-employed today. It looks like he might have been starting from scratch.
Many questions. Thank you very much, Nick Watt there. I'm joined now by Mel Stride, Conservative MP and Chair of the Treasury Select Committee, and Labour's Rachael Maskell, who's Shadow Secretary of State for Employment Rights. If I start with you, Mel, good evening. Thank you for joining us. If I was a decorator, am I not going to go to work tomorrow?
As I understand the way that this proposal works, if you qualify for the support, you could receive up to £2,500 for a period of 3 months. But there's nothing within the scheme that I'm aware of that would prevent somebody from working. But of course, that would be subject to the government's overall guidelines, which are that you should really be working if it's essential and you can't work from home.
But that's the point, isn't it? You know, at the BBC here, we've spoken to a lot of people who are self-employed, were waiting for this announcement and genuinely feel awful about going to decorate someone's house, which isn't essential work, but they can't do it from home, but they need the money. The first payments aren't going to come in until June. They're still going to go out to work and be on a train.
You're absolutely right. So the Treasury Select Committee has gone out. It's had a call for evidence. We've had an unprecedented response from the self-employed in particular, 14,000 people contacting us and sharing their thoughts and concerns. And certainly rapid payment is right near the top of the list. But I don't think we should overlook how, firstly, bold this particular offer is. £2,500 per month was considerably more than many were expecting, and matches, of course, what's going to be made available to employees of businesses. And the second thing is it's very comprehensive, so it's covering about 95% of those who are self-employed, and the 5% that are being excluded are those who have profits in excess of 50,000 and an average, I think, of £200,000. So whilst this scheme is never going to be absolutely perfect and it's going to be very difficult to roll it out, because bear in mind that the scheme that was put forward for the employees of businesses, there's already a PAYE system in place to facilitate that, whereas you're really having to build a lot of this system from scratch, and it involves about 3.5 million people potentially. So this is a huge mountain to climb. But one of the things that my committee is going to be doing is be looking very closely, particularly at this timing aspect, because we do recognise that people need this money as quickly as possible.
But this was the announcement from the Chancellor today. People were waiting for this. And if they don't want to go to work because they're worried about spreading the virus, they aren't going to be able to make it until June, or potentially with the big queues we've seen to the universal credit system, however long that will take. So if you really want to stop people from going to work, How are you going to do that with what was announced today, the self-employed?
What the Chancellor has said, and I totally accept, and I say this as the Treasury Select Committee chair, and it's our job to hold the government to account. I'm not speaking for the government, but what the Chancellor has said and what we must put to the test is firstly that people can go on to universal credit, and he's made that more generous and easier to access for the self-employed, and has pointed out that there will be advances available, so people should not have to wait for that. And he's also pointed to the business interruption loans, which will be available and could therefore act as a bridge between now and when these finances come on stream in early June. But I agree with you. What we've got to do is we've got to hold the government to account, and we've got to press very hard as a committee to make sure that every single stop is pulled, to make sure that that money is available as soon as possible. And it's very interesting that the Chancellor, to look precisely at what he said up until no later than the beginning of June. So rather implying that there's a possibility, if they really put all the stops out and work 24/7 on this, that this might be possible to roll out a little bit earlier. And that's one of the main focuses that the committee will be to making sure that we ensure that the government delivers as rapidly as possible.
But just go back to my example, because I did actually speak to a decorator this week on the radio who got in touch to say, I will be the first to put my paintbrush down and not go to work once I've heard from the Chancellor. How quickly can that gentleman get some money in his pocket? Could it be next week?
Well, I don't know his specific circumstances, but for example, he will be able to access universal credit. There could be an advance on that, so that would be a matter that would be a matter of days, although there is a challenge here in terms of the sheer level of demand that there is on the universal credit system at the moment, and the number of people getting in touch with the Department of Work and Pensions about that. So that's another area that my committee will need to be focused on. But look, at the end of the day, Emma, nobody is saying that this announcement today is going to solve all the problems, and you will be able to point to numerous different situations which are far, far from ideal.
No, it's just that we do have examples coming into us. Like you said, thousands got in touch with you, and it's actually useful when somebody fits that template to understand how quickly. Can I just ask, what do you think it's a mistake by the government not to send those people who do qualify, taking all that into account, a cheque for, let's say, £1,000?
Well, what they said is that those that will qualify will receive payments up to £2,500 directly into their bank accounts, and HMRC will be contacting those individuals to fill in a simple form online in order to apply for that money. And that seems to me, in principle, to be the right way to approach this.
Just Mel, while I've got you then, a final question. You mentioned there that it's a difficult system to build, that they're getting in place, unlike PAYE, which is already there. Why wasn't anything in place already when you've done pandemic modelling and planning as a government? We just heard from Nick Watt there that pandemic planning experience took place in 2016. Was the Chancellor starting from scratch?
Well, I don't think, with great respect, I mean, you can expect governments to be ready for every single possible eventuality in every single possible way, given the momentous, extraordinary events that are unfolding before us. There's inevitably an element of reacting and catching up and positioning and reconfiguring government to handle what is an extraordinary once-in-a-100-year crisis. And these are big challenges. But what my committee will be doing is making sure we hold the government to account. We had the Chancellor appear before us last week. We've had our call for evidence. We've got a huge amount of information to go through. We're following up on these points to work together with government in a critical but constructive way to make sure that we deliver as best we can collectively, actually right across the House of Commons, for these hard-working people up and down this country who are very worried at the current time.
They are indeed. Mel Stride, thank you for your time. Let's move to Rachael Maskell for Labour. Do you welcome today's package for the self-employed? You've been waiting for this, you've been pushing for this?
Well, this long-awaited package isn't going to pay the bills this week, next month, or even the month after. And therefore, whilst we welcome money being set apart, we are really concerned that people are going to be left in poverty. And of course, the consequences of that means that people are going to go out to work, put their lives and other lives at risk because they'll have no choice. I spoke to a constituent today waiting 3 weeks before they can even get an appointment for universal credit, and then another 5 weeks before they get any money. That takes them into June as well. People are desperate today. They've already lost their jobs for a number of weeks, and they're just not getting the money on the table. They have to pay their bills, and they're getting very, very concerned.
I mean, we're of course talking about the self-employed in the respect, when you say people have lost jobs, of course there's a whole other background. Their partner may be in a difficult situation as well. But it does take time to build a system like this. And what we just heard there from somebody who's tasked with holding the government to account on this is that you want to get it right. And you also want to be in a situation where people can get some advances through universal credit. And he seemed to be saying that that could be possible as of next week.
Well, clearly out of touch with what's happening on the ground. And the reality is we've known about this problem. We had the first case of coronavirus in the UK in January, and only today are we hearing about a package for the self-employed. There are still workers who are going to get nothing at the moment. The zero-hour contract workers, many people who are freelancing supply teachers don't know what their future holds. And therefore, the Chancellor's going to have to come back and plug the gaps which is left now, because it is mainly the poorest people in our country who are having to shoulder the greatest burden. And of course, they're the people who are most at risk as well. As I hear today that many workers are being almost forced into work against what on Monday appeared the Prime Minister's advice, and are being exposed to huge risks to their own health. We have got to lock down this country, pay people the money they need to survive. This must be about prioritising people's health and their welfare. And at the moment, the government is still far, far too slow in reacting.
But at the same time, this has been praised by people who you may not have expected to praise. Rishi Sunak, a Conservative Chancellor, Bernie Sanders, a socialist who'd like to be the next president of the United States, has praised Britain today for its measures and for what it's doing for its people financially.
Well, Labour are standing up for people across our communities, and we know the daily stories. I've had an 11-hour surgery today listening to the plight of my constituents, deeply concerned at this time. That is real life, and that's obviously what we're going to use as the measure to hold these new announcements up by, because the reality of people's lives is what matters, and we've got to make sure that people get through this dreadful time, both with their health being protected, but also their welfare. People are very worried about what's going to happen if they can't pay the bills, and the Chancellor did not have the solutions today.
Rachael Maskell, thank you.